The bitter winter of 1832 settled over Virginia's Tidewater region with an unforgiving cold that seemed to penetrate not just the physical landscape, but the very souls of those who lived beneath its gray skies. The James River freezing at its edges in ways that disrupted the maritime commerce sustaining the region's declining economy, while creating temporary pathways across waters that normally served as boundaries between plantations and as barriers to movement that slavery's enforcers depended upon. In the slave quarters of Westover Hall, one of the oldest estates in the Tidewater's colonial heartland, where families claimed descent from Virginia's first English settlers, and where pretensions to aristocratic grandeur persisted, despite economic realities that made such claims increasingly hollow. Household servants gathered in the January darkness and spoke in voices that carried both profound skepticism and something that might have been the faintest whisper of hope about an extraordinary purchase that had been completed 2 weeks earlier at the Richmond slave market. According to local legend, what had transpired that December morning violated every pattern they had observed across decades of watching how Virginia's first families made decisions about acquiring human property, suggesting possibilities that seemed too improbable to credit yet too specific in their details to dismiss as mere wishful imagination, constructed to make unbearable circumstances slightly more tolerable through fantasies of deliverance that reality would inevitably crush. Fragmentary records suggest that what unfolded over the next 15 months would become a story whispered, not as another chronicle of suffering passively endured, but as evidence that even within the Tidewater's ancient plantation aristocracy, where slavery's roots ran deepest and where resistance seemed most impossible, given the comprehensive surveillance and systematic brutality that centuries of practice had refined to terrible efficiency, unexpected alliances could form between people whom every social convention and legal structure insisted must remain forever separated by unbridgeable divisions, creating possibilities for liberation that demonstrated the institution's fundamental vulnerability when moral conviction combined with strategic intelligence and the kind of calculated courage that understood both the enormous risks involved and the even greater costs of remaining complicit in a system whose evil became more undeniable with every passing day of proximity to its daily operations. Virginia's Tidewater region in the early 1830s represented American slavery's oldest and supposedly most refined manifestation, a landscape where families trace their lineages to colonial governors and royal land grants, where fortunes built on tobacco cultivation across generations had created a self-conscious elite that measured itself against European nobility, and that claimed a civilized approach to human bondage, supposedly distinguishing their operations from the crude brutality of newer slave states in the Deep South. Yet this self-image of paternalistic refinement masked economic realities that made the Tidewater's slavery increasingly precarious. Soil exhaustion from centuries of intensive tobacco cultivation had reduced yields to levels that made continued plantation operations marginal at best, forcing aristocratic families to confront the reality that their most valuable asset was no longer land, but the enslaved people who worked it, and that maintaining their elaborate lifestyles required selling those people south and west to feed the Cotton Kingdom's insatiable hunger for labor. Even as such sales tore apart families and communities that had existed on Tidewater estates for generations. Richmond had become the commercial center for this trade in human beings, with slave markets operating openly near the docks where the James River met ocean-going commerce. Their advertisements in newspapers discussing people with the casual language used for livestock, while simultaneously claiming that Virginia slavery was more humane and civilized than the brutal operations of Mississippi or Alabama. The market in Richmond served planters from throughout the Tidewater and Piedmont regions, who came to buy and sell human beings when estate settlements. Financial pressures or operational adjustments required modifications to their enslaved labor forces. And it functioned with rituals designed to reduce complex human lives to simple commercial transactions. With auctioneers cataloging physical capabilities and estimated productive value in language that deliberately obscured the moral horror of treating people as fungible property, whose worth could be calculated through formulas that assigned dollar values to human muscles and supposedly measured the years of labor that could be extracted before bodies broke under demands that made no allowance for the humanity of those subjected to such brutal mathematics. The legal structures governing Virginia slavery in 1832 reflected 2 centuries of legislative development that had created one of the most comprehensive slave codes in the world, forbidding enslaved people from learning to read, from gathering without white supervision, from traveling without written passes, from testifying against white people in legal proceedings, creating frameworks of control that attempted to eliminate every possible avenue for autonomous action or resistance, and that claimed to make permanent subjection both legally unassailable and practically inescapable, regardless of how desperately people might long for freedom, or how intelligently they might search for vulnerabilities in systems that insisted their authority was absolute. Yet even the Tidewater's ancient slavery confronted realities that complicated absolute control. Free Black people existed in the region in substantial numbers, perhaps 15,000 by 1830, their very presence creating ambiguities that made surveillance more difficult and that demonstrated through their mere existence that the boundaries between enslaved and free were more permeable than slavery's defenders claimed or could afford to acknowledge. Into this world of declining agricultural fortunes masked by aristocratic pretensions, of comprehensive legal controls confronting social complications, of systematic brutality coexisting with elaborate claims about civilized refinement that supposedly distinguished Virginia slavery from cruder manifestations elsewhere, came two people whose encounter would reveal that even marriages of long standing within the Tidewater's most established families could conceal profound disagreements about the fundamental morality of the system that sustained their households, and that such disagreements could manifest in actions that violated every expectation about how white women from Virginia's first families were supposed to relate to the enslaved people whose labor made their privileged existence possible. Stories passed down through generations claim that the December morning in 1832, when William and Catherine Randolph attended the Richmond slave market, began with a conversation that had been recurring with increasing frequency and mounting tension over recent months. A discussion about Westover Hall's financial situation and the decisions that declining tobacco revenues and mounting debts seemed to require if the estate was to remain viable, and if the family was to maintain the social standing that their colonial-era pedigree supposedly entitled them to preserve. William had concluded that the plantation's survival demanded selling multiple enslaved workers to raise capital that would satisfy creditors who were becoming increasingly insistent about debt repayment, and that might provide resources for diversifying into wheat cultivation or other crops that could generate revenues tobacco, no longer provided in sufficient quantities. He had identified specific individuals whose sale would generate needed money while theoretically maintaining adequate labor for the estate's reduced operations. Though these calculations required separating families who had lived at Westover Hall for multiple generations, and whose community bonds represented the only protection enslaved people possessed against slavery's worst cruelties. But Catherine had opposed this plan with a persistence that William found both surprising, given her usual deference to his judgment in plantation matters, and increasingly frustrating as her objections prevented him from executing decisions he considered economically essential, and that he believed his position as master of Westover Hall entitled him to make without interference from his wife, regardless of whatever sentimental concerns she might harbor. She had argued that the sales he proposed would destroy family units that had existed at Westover Hall since her grandfather's time. That surely alternatives existed that didn't require inflicting such devastation on people whose labor had sustained the Randolph family's prosperity and social standing across decades. That perhaps they could accept more dramatic reductions in their own standard of living rather than financing their continued comfort through actions she considered morally intolerable violations of obligations that slaveholders owed to people who had no power to resist such treatment, but whose humanity and dignity she believed created moral claims that economic calculations should not be allowed to override completely. The disagreement had remained unresolved as they traveled to Richmond that morning, William intending to complete transactions he viewed as unavoidable economic necessities, while Catherine hoped desperately to find some way to prevent what she considered unconscionable separations that would haunt her conscience for whatever remained of her life. According to oral histories preserved among enslaved communities who maintained careful records of events that official documentation systematically excluded, the morning's auction proceeded according to William's plans through its initial stages, with him successfully arranging the sale of 5 field workers, including 2 families being separated in ways that divided parents from children and husbands from wives, for prices that would provide temporary relief from creditor pressures. That had been consuming his attention for months and making his sleep fitful with anxieties about maintaining Westover Hall's operations and the family's social position among Virginia's first families. But when the auctioneer brought a man named Fen Young to the block, 7 feet and 8 inches tall, with a physique suggesting tremendous physical strength combined with a bearing that even the degrading rituals of the market couldn't fully suppress. Described by the auctioneer as someone who had been sold 4 times in 6 years because previous owners found him unsuited to proper subordination, despite his obvious capacity for the heaviest plantation labor. Something shifted in the dynamic between William and Catherine that would alter not just that day's events, but the fundamental trajectory of their marriage and their relationship to the institution that had sustained their family across generations. Catherine had watched the morning's earlier sales with anguish she could no longer conceal or suppress, her face revealing distress so profound that William had noticed despite his focus on conducting transactions, though he attributed her obvious suffering to feminine sentiment that he assumed would dissipate once she accepted the economic logic of decisions he had made after what he considered careful and responsible analysis of their circumstances. But when she saw Fen Yang standing on that platform, when she heard the auctioneer's descriptions that barely coded brutal treatment as management difficulties and resistance to proper authority, when she observed the intelligence in his eyes that suggested active assessment of his circumstances, even in that moment of extreme vulnerability and public humiliation, Catherine made a decision that decades of apparently harmonious marriage within one of Virginia's most distinguished families had given no indication she possessed the capacity or courage to make. She turned to William and told him in a voice that carried an authority he had never heard from her regarding any matter related to plantation business or the management of enslaved workers that they would purchase this man, that the money he had just raised through sales that had shattered her heart and violated what she considered their most fundamental moral obligations would be used to acquire someone whose description suggested exactly the kind of management challenges that prudent planters with any understanding of proper plantation operations normally avoided at all costs. William's response combined profound shock at what he perceived as his wife's unprecedented presumption to dictate decisions about matters that were properly and exclusively his responsibility as master of Westover Hall, mounting anger at her apparent attempt to undermine choices he had made after careful economic analysis, and genuine bewilderment about what she could possibly hope to accomplish by insisting on such an acquisition that made no rational sense given their precarious financial circumstances, and that would likely create operational problems their already strained plantation could not possibly accommodate. He told her that the suggestion was economically absurd and operationally reckless, that they had come to raise money rather than spend it, that purchasing someone described as resistant to proper subordination would create management problems that would require brutal discipline that he found distasteful, and that might ultimately necessitate selling the acquisition at a loss, that her interference in matters she did not understand was jeopardizing decisions that their family's survival and social standing depended upon him making correctly. But Catherine's insistence was unyielding in ways that transcended mere disagreement to communicate that she was acting on convictions she considered more fundamental than his authority. Their economic circumstances, the social expectations that normally governed her behavior as mistress of one of the Tidewater's most distinguished estates, or even the stability of their marriage that such defiance might permanently damage. She told him that if he would not bid, she would find means to make the purchase herself using inheritance from her family, that Virginia law gave her limited but real control over, despite her married status. That this was a line she was drawing about what she would tolerate happening in her name and with her complicity. She made clear that she had acquiesced to the sales that morning, had watched families being destroyed, because she lacked the legal power to prevent transactions he was determined to complete, but that she absolutely would not allow this day to pass without taking some action that honored her own moral convictions. Even if that action created complications, he would find difficult to manage, and even if he never understood or forgave her insistence on this matter that she recognized violated every expectation he held about how their household should function and how decisions about enslaved people should be made. Faced with what amounted to an ultimatum delivered in tones that suggested profound moral conviction rather than temporary emotional excess, and acutely aware that other Tidewater planters were observing this unprecedented public disagreement between husband and wife over matters that every social convention and legal principle decreed belonged exclusively to male authority, William bid on Fen Yang with mounting resentment, but also with a kind of wary recognition that his wife of 23 years was revealing aspects of her character and convictions that their marriage had somehow never fully brought into view, despite decades of daily proximity and what he had believed was genuine intimacy and mutual understanding. He competed against 3 other bidders who recognized Fen Yang's obvious value for the heaviest plantation labor, despite the warnings about management difficulties that his history of sales suggested, and he finally secured him for $1,900, a sum that consumed nearly everything he had raised through the morning's earlier sales, and that left him with minimal net benefit from transactions that had cost him enormous emotional effort to execute, and that had violated his own sense of what proper treatment of enslaved people who had served his family loyally across generations should involve. As they completed the purchase and arranged for Fenyang to be transported to Westover Hall, William demanded explanations for behavior he found both incomprehensible and profoundly threatening to his understanding of how their household functioned and how his authority over plantation matters was supposed to operate without challenge from his wife, regardless of whatever personal feelings she might harbor about specific decisions. But Catherine declined to provide details that would satisfy his increasingly urgent questions, speaking instead about moral obligations and Christian duties and divine judgment in language so general and so carefully vague that it seemed deliberately calculated to avoid revealing whatever specific purposes motivated her unprecedented insistence, while making clear that those purposes reflected convictions she considered non-negotiable regardless of the consequences such stubborn adherence might create for their marriage, and for the social standing they both depended upon maintaining among Virginia's first families. What William did not know, what Catherine's extraordinarily careful discretion across many years had successfully concealed from him, despite the daily proximity that marriage and household management created, was that his wife had been conducting a quiet but increasingly comprehensive campaign of resistance against slavery's brutalities that manifested in ways he never noticed, because he assumed her household management decisions reflected the same economic calculations and social expectations that governed his own thinking, rather than moral convictions that would have alarmed him profoundly and perhaps even terrified him, had he understood their true nature and increasingly radical extent. Catherine had grown up in a family whose Episcopalian faith emphasized Christian obligations to treat all humans with basic dignity while somehow accommodating the reality of slaveholding in ways that created profound internal contradictions that sensitive individuals found increasingly difficult to maintain. And she had inherited from her mother a conviction that slavery violated fundamental Christian principles about human equality before God, even as economic realities and social pressures made open opposition to the institution seem both futile and socially suicidal for families whose entire way of life depended absolutely on the labor of enslaved people. When she married William and became mistress of Westover Hall, Catherine had initially hoped that she might influence him toward more humane treatment of enslaved workers. That daily proximity and her gentle persuasion might soften whatever abstract justifications allowed him to maintain the system with apparent moral comfort, despite the obvious suffering it created for people whose humanity was undeniable to anyone willing to see. But she had gradually recognized that William's commitment to slavery transcended simple economic interest, to reflect deeply internalized beliefs about racial hierarchy and the naturalness of black servitude that made him genuinely unable to see enslaved people as fully human in ways that created moral obligations comparable to those owed to white people. That his entire sense of social order and his understanding of Virginia's history, and his family's distinguished place in that history, depended upon accepting slavery as both necessary and fundamentally legitimate, despite whatever regrettable excesses individual cruel masters might commit. This painful recognition had led Catherine to begin taking actions she could never acknowledge to her husband. Using her authority over household operations and her relationships with enslaved women who worked in close daily proximity to her to create small spaces of relative safety and autonomy that mitigated slavery's worst effects without directly challenging William's ultimate control over plantation operations. She taught household servants to read despite laws forbidding literacy, and despite the severe punishments both teacher and students would face if discovered. Understanding that education represented a form of power that circumstances might someday make valuable for those who possessed it. She maintained careful contacts with Quaker families in Richmond and in surrounding areas whose continuing commitment to anti-slavery principles made them sympathetic to providing assistance even when social and economic pressures prevented open opposition to an institution so fundamental to Virginia society that challenging it seemed to require rejecting the entire social order. Most significantly, Catherine had been systematically studying escape routes and learning about the networks that assisted fugitives toward freedom, despite the enormous legal risks such assistance involved, accumulating knowledge and developing contacts that she had no immediate plan to use, but that she recognized might prove crucial if circumstances ever created opportunities to help someone reach liberty. When she saw Fenyang on that auction block, when she heard the auctioneer's descriptions of his repeated resistance to total subjection that had made him commercially problematic despite his obvious physical capabilities, when she observed the intelligence in his bearing that suggested he remained fundamentally unbroken, despite brutal attempts across multiple ownerships to suppress his spirit and force him into the complete subordination that slavery demanded. Catherine recognized someone who was marked for eventual destruction through sale to the Deep South's most brutal cotton or sugar operations, where life expectancy was measured in single-digit years, and where any hope of survival with dignity intact would be systematically eliminated through violence designed to extract maximum short-term productivity regardless of long-term human costs. In that moment of recognition, Catherine made a decision she had been moving toward for years, without fully acknowledging even to herself the radical implications of what she was contemplating: that she would use whatever resources and influence her position as mistress of one of Virginia's most distinguished estates provided to help this man not just survive the immediate threat of sale to worse circumstances, but to actually escape to freedom, regardless of the profound risk such assistance would create for her own security and social standing, and regardless of how her husband would react if he ever discovered what she was actually doing behind the facade of dutiful plantation mistress that she had maintained so carefully across decades of marriage. Fenyang arrived at Westover Hall on a December evening when winter cold had settled deeply into the Tidewater landscape, and when the plantation's rhythms were adjusting to patterns that would govern operations through the coldest months when field work was limited, and when enslaved people's labor focused on maintenance tasks and preparation for the coming agricultural season. William assigned Fenyang immediately to the most demanding and unpleasant work available during winter months: clearing drainage ditches in partially frozen ground, repairing fences in exposed locations where wind made the cold nearly unbearable, moving massive timbers and equipment that would require teams of normal-sized workers to handle. The labor was brutal by design, William believing that establishing dominance over new acquisitions required demonstrating immediately that their size or history of resistance offered no protection whatsoever from the total authority that ownership conveyed, and that the sooner they accepted the absolute futility of continued resistance, the more smoothly plantation operations would function, and the less severe the discipline required to maintain proper order. But what William did not observe, what the plantation's daily routines and the social conventions governing interactions between masters and enslaved workers made essentially invisible to him as he focused his attention on managing declining revenues and mounting debts and maintaining Westover Hall's operations and the family's social standing, was that Catherine began finding ways to communicate with Fenyang that appeared entirely routine and appropriate from any external observation, but that actually served purposes her husband would have found both incomprehensible and absolutely intolerable had he understood what was actually occurring under his own roof, and within the plantation operations he believed he controlled completely. She would bring hot food and additional clothing to field workers during the coldest parts of winter days, a practice that William viewed as appropriate concern for maintaining valuable property in good working condition. But that gave Catherine brief opportunities to speak with Fenyang in contexts where conversations could be disguised as simple instructions about tasks or inquiries about his adjustment to plantation routines. She assigned him to maintenance work on various outbuildings and equipment near the main house, labor that his extraordinary strength made him obviously well suited for, but that also placed him in locations where slightly longer exchanges could occur without attracting attention from overseers or other enslaved workers, who might feel obligated to report unusual interactions between the mistress and a field worker, who should have no legitimate reason for extended contact with household operations. Most crucially, she arranged for him to have responsibilities that occasionally required travel to Richmond or to neighboring plantations to collect supplies or deliver items. Journeys that William viewed as efficient use of someone whose size made him capable of transporting heavy loads, but that actually served Catherine's carefully concealed purposes by giving Fenyang knowledge of roads and opportunities to develop familiarity with the broader landscape that could prove essential if escape ever became possible. Through these extraordinarily carefully orchestrated interactions, Catherine communicated information that Fenyang received with profound wariness and deep skepticism, born from years of experiencing white people's capacity for manipulation and betrayal, even when they presented themselves as sympathetic or helpful. She told him that she opposed slavery on moral grounds despite her position as mistress of one of the Tidewater's most distinguished estates, that she maintained contacts through religious networks who could provide assistance to those seeking freedom despite the severe legal penalties such activities invited, that she would help him escape when circumstances made such assistance feasible without creating immediate suspicions that would endanger everyone involved in the attempt. Fenyang listened to these communications while maintaining the kind of careful skepticism that survival had taught him was essential when dealing with white people's promises. Understanding that some slaveholders used false offers of assistance to identify those contemplating resistance so that brutal public examples could be made that would discourage others from harboring similar thoughts about escape or rebellion. But he also recognized that his circumstances at Westover Hall might never again provide opportunities like those Catherine seemed to be offering, and that refusing potential assistance simply because it seemed improbable or because trust seemed impossibly risky might itself be a form of excessive caution that kept people enslaved when freedom could be achieved through calculated risk-taking that balanced dangers against possibilities. The winter and spring of 1833 brought a period of extraordinarily careful mutual assessment, during which Catherine worked systematically to demonstrate to Fenyang that her assistance was genuine, and that her commitment to helping him escape reflected authentic moral conviction rather than some elaborate deception designed to expose resistance. While Fenyang simultaneously tested the authenticity of her claims through small acts of resistance and requests for assistance that could reveal whether she would report him to William, or whether her opposition to slavery was substantial enough to withstand the pressures and dangers that actually assisting escape would necessarily involve. Catherine began providing increasingly specific and detailed information about routes north toward Pennsylvania and freedom, explaining with remarkable precision the locations of Quaker families and free Black communities who might offer assistance despite the enormous risks such help involved, sharing knowledge about patrol patterns and surveillance techniques that could help someone avoid detection during the most dangerous early stages of flight, when proximity to the plantation made recapture most likely. She gave him access to maps and written materials that helped him understand the complex and dangerous geography between the Tidewater and Free Territory, resources that her education and social position allowed her to possess without raising suspicions, but that would result in severe punishment, including possible sale to the Deep South for any enslaved person discovered with such materials. Most significantly and most dangerously for everyone involved, Catherine began systematically accumulating concrete resources that would be absolutely necessary for any realistic chance of successful escape. Carefully preserved food that could sustain someone through weeks of careful travel while avoiding populated areas where questions might be asked. Clothing appropriate for varied terrain and weather conditions that would be encountered during an extended journey northward. And most crucially and most risky to obtain, forged papers identifying Fenyang as a free Black man named Frederick Thompson traveling on legitimate business. Documents that she obtained through Quaker contacts in Richmond, who took truly extraordinary personal risks to assist those seeking freedom, and who operated with the kind of careful coordination and strict security consciousness that made their assistance remarkably effective despite the comprehensive legal apparatus and professional slave-catching operations designed to prevent exactly what they were facilitating. Fenyang, observing these increasingly substantial preparations, while continuing to test Catherine's sincerity through requests and actions that would reveal whether she would report resistance to William or to the overseers who maintained daily discipline, gradually came to believe with increasing confidence that her opposition to slavery was authentic and deeply rooted, and that her assistance represented genuine possibilities for achieving freedom, despite the truly formidable obstacles that any escape attempt from the Tidewater would necessarily involve given the region's dense population, comprehensive surveillance systems, and the professional slave-catching operations that made the area particularly dangerous for fugitives. By late spring of 1833, the extraordinarily careful preparations that Catherine and Fenyang had maintained for months with remarkable discipline and security consciousness began moving toward actual implementation, as circumstances created an opportunity that years of careful planning and patient preparation had positioned them to recognize and exploit when it finally materialized. William needed to travel to Williamsburg and Norfolk for extended negotiations with multiple creditors about comprehensive debt restructuring that might provide breathing room for Westover Hall's declining operations. Business that would require at least 3 weeks away from the plantation, and that would leave Catherine in practical day-to-day control of operations with less oversight than she normally experienced. She communicated to Fenyang through their carefully established methods that he should prepare to attempt escape during this window of opportunity, that she would create the specific conditions necessary for departure, but that precise timing would depend on multiple variables that neither could completely predict or control in advance, and that flexibility and quick decision-making would be essential when the moment finally arrived. The plan they had developed with meticulous attention to every detail they could anticipate involved Fenyang leaving Westover Hall on what would appear to any observer to be a completely routine errand to Richmond to collect supplies and equipment that Catherine had ordered for various plantation operations. A task he had performed multiple times before, and that would not immediately raise suspicions or trigger searches when he failed to return within the expected timeframes that such journeys normally required. But instead of returning to Westover Hall after reaching Richmond and completing the ostensible business that justified his travel, he would continue north using routes Catherine had mapped with remarkable precision, carrying the forged papers that identified him as Frederick Thompson, and substantial money she had provided that would allow him to purchase passage on stages or boats that could dramatically accelerate his journey toward Pennsylvania and reduce the time he would need to spend moving on foot through dangerous territory where his extraordinary height made remaining inconspicuous essentially impossible. The opportunity finally arrived in June 1833, during the second week after William had departed for his extended business trip, and when weather conditions seemed as favorable as they were likely to become for someone undertaking the kind of extended journey that escape to Pennsylvania would require. Catherine sent Fenyang to Richmond with an elaborately detailed list of supplies to purchase, and with a wagon that ostensibly would be needed to transport those materials back to Westover Hall. But she also provided him with the carefully forged papers identifying him as Frederick Thompson. With money sufficient to sustain him through weeks of careful travel and to purchase various forms of transportation, and with extraordinarily detailed written instructions about specific contacts he should seek in Richmond and at calculated intervals along the route north, who could provide further assistance and guidance toward safe passage into Pennsylvania. Their final conversation before his departure, as preserved in oral traditions that were maintained with remarkable consistency across generations by the networks that had assisted his flight, and by enslaved communities who viewed his escape as evidence that freedom remained achievable even from the Tidewater's ancient slavery, acknowledged both the profound gratitude Fenyang felt for assistance he had never imagined receiving from someone in Catherine's position, and the recognition that she was taking truly extraordinary risks that could destroy not just her marriage, but her entire social existence if her role in his escape were discovered by William or by the broader Tidewater Society whose approval she needed to maintain her position, and whose judgment would be absolutely merciless if they learned that one of their own had actively facilitated the escape of valuable property. Fenyang left Westover Hall on a June morning when summer heat was already building, but when the day still promised to be manageable for someone undertaking what was ostensibly a routine journey to Richmond and back to collect supplies for plantation operations. He traveled to Richmond as instructed, made carefully selective purchases that would establish the appearance of having conducted legitimate business, then quietly met with Quaker contacts that Catherine had arranged, who provided him with additional resources and detailed guidance before he abandoned the wagon at a carefully predetermined location and continued north, moving initially on foot through areas where his use of roads might attract unwanted attention, but gradually transitioning to purchased transportation on stages and boats as he moved into regions where his forged papers and his careful adoption of the mannerisms of a free black tradesman traveling on legitimate business allowed him to move with decreasing danger of immediate detection. The journey from the Tidewater to free territory in Pennsylvania required weeks of extraordinarily careful travel through landscapes where slave patrols operated with comprehensive legal authority and powerful financial incentives to capture fugitives, where any black person's presence without ironclad documentation could result in immediate arrest and sale regardless of actual legal status, and where professional slave catchers with years of experience tracking fugitives maintained systematic surveillance of routes and locations that escapees commonly used in their desperate attempts to reach freedom. According to the fragmentary but remarkably consistent accounts that were preserved in oral histories maintained by the Quaker networks and free black communities who had assisted fugitives for decades, Fenyang successfully navigated these truly formidable challenges through an extraordinary combination of Catherine's meticulous preparation that had anticipated and addressed numerous potential obstacles, his own intelligence and resourcefulness that had been developed and honed through years of resistance to multiple owners' brutal attempts to break his spirit, and assistance from dozens of people who took enormous personal risks to help someone they had never met, simply because they believed that human beings possessed inherent dignity and rights that no legal system could legitimately deny, regardless of what laws and customs and economic interests claimed. By August 1833, Fenyang had successfully reached Pennsylvania and was making his way toward the well-established free black communities in Philadelphia, where he could receive comprehensive support for creating a completely new identity under the name Frederick Thompson, and for finding employment that would allow him to sustain himself in freedom, and perhaps eventually to help others achieve what he had accomplished. What happened to him in the years following his arrival in free territory remains largely undocumented in any official records, as survival required that fugitives maintain the most careful possible discretion about their origins and the specific circumstances of their escape to avoid providing any information that could be used for recapture or that might endanger the networks and individuals who had risked everything to assist their flight. Though some accounts preserved in oral traditions suggest that he eventually made his way to Canada, where he could live without the constant fear of kidnapping by slave catchers that made life precarious even in free states. While other stories claim he remained in Philadelphia, where he not only established himself successfully, but eventually became active in assisting other fugitives along the routes he had traveled, using hard-won knowledge from his own escape to help others achieve the freedom he had found. Back at Westover Hall, Catherine managed the aftermath of Fenyang's disappearance with a performance she had prepared with the same meticulous attention to detail that had characterized every aspect of her assistance to his escape. Expressing carefully calibrated initial surprise when he failed to return from Richmond within expected timeframes and suggesting various plausible explanations, ranging from accident to illness to simple opportunistic flight that she claimed to find puzzling given that he had seemed to be adjusting reasonably well to plantation routines and had shown no obvious signs of planning resistance. When William returned from his extended business trip to discover that the acquisition his wife had so inexplicably insisted upon barely 6 months earlier had vanished, his response combined multiple layers of anger and frustration. Fury about the substantial financial loss the disappearance represented at a time when the family could least afford such setbacks. Intensified bewilderment about what Catherine had been thinking when she insisted on a purchase that now seemed even more incomprehensible and economically irrational. And profound discomfort with the reality that his own extended absence from Westover Hall had created the conditions that made escape possible in ways that complicated any attempt to assign blame exclusively to Catherine's management of operations during his time away. He organized extensive searches and offered substantial rewards, contacted the most experienced slave catchers operating in Virginia, and placed detailed advertisements in newspapers throughout the region describing Fenyang's extraordinary and unmistakable height and offering significant payment for any information leading to his recovery. But the trail had gone cold with a completeness that suggested either truly remarkable luck or assistance that was so well organized and carefully executed that even professional pursuers with decades of experience tracking fugitives through terrain, they knew with intimate familiarity found themselves unable to discover any trace of where he had gone or how he had managed to disappear so thoroughly despite his physical distinctiveness that should have made him essentially impossible to conceal. Whether William ever developed serious suspicions about Catherine's potential role in Fenyang's escape remains genuinely uncertain from the fragmentary and often contradictory evidence that survived in various forms. Though if such doubts emerged in his mind, he never voiced them in ways that created documented confrontations or that left traces in correspondence or other records that might have revealed his thinking. Perhaps because directly accusing his wife of facilitating the escape would have required acknowledging possibilities about her convictions and her willingness to act on those convictions that would have fundamentally destabilized not just their marriage, but his entire understanding of how their household functioned and how the social order he had spent his entire life believing in and defending actually operated. Catherine maintained the most careful possible discretion about her involvement for the remainder of her life, understanding with absolute clarity that any revelation of the truth could endanger not just herself, but dozens of other people who had participated directly or indirectly in the networks that had made Fenyang's escape possible, and that continued to assist other fugitives, despite the truly severe legal penalties and social consequences their activities invited if discovered. The substantial financial loss from Fenyang's disappearance, combined with William's other mounting economic pressures, eventually forced him to make increasingly dramatic adjustments to Westover Hall's operations. Though whether these changes reflected purely economic necessity, or whether they were influenced by any shifts in his own thinking about slavery's long-term sustainability, or about the morality of an institution that even his own wife had apparently found intolerable, remains impossible to determine from the available historical evidence. The impact of Fenyang's escape rippled through enslaved communities throughout the Tidewater and beyond, in ways that official records controlled by slaveholders never captured, but that oral traditions maintained with remarkable consistency across multiple generations preserved as powerful evidence that freedom remained achievable even from the heart of Virginia's oldest and supposedly most secure slavery. For enslaved people throughout the region, the story of someone so physically distinctive and so closely watched successfully escaping from one of the Tidewater's most distinguished estates became compelling proof that careful planning combined with unexpected assistance could overcome even the most comprehensive surveillance and control mechanisms that centuries of practice had refined. That the system's claims about the impossibility of successful resistance and the absolute futility of attempting escape were self-serving lies designed to maintain psychological control. But that did not reflect the actual realities about what determined and intelligent people could achieve when opportunities materialized and when courage allowed them to act despite the very real dangers involved. And sometimes, according to the legends that communities preserved with remarkable care, when official history controlled by those who benefited from slavery tried systematically to erase such stories, that resistance stood 7 feet 8 inches tall, purchased at a wife's insistence not to be exploited but to be saved. Assisted by one of the Tidewater's most distinguished plantation mistresses, whose moral convictions led her to violate every expectation of her position, and whose meticulous planning and sustained courage created possibilities that the system insisted could never exist within Virginia's ancient slavery. Fenyang's journey from Richmond's auction block to freedom in Pennsylvania lasted barely 6 months from purchase to escape. But his story became an enduring part of the traditions through which enslaved communities preserved both hope and practical knowledge about resistance across generations, offering proof that freedom was achievable even from circumstances that seemed most hopeless. That moral conviction could lead people to risk everything they possessed to help others escape bondage. And that human dignity and the fundamental yearning for liberty could never be completely suppressed regardless of how comprehensive the apparatus of oppression or how ancient and supposedly unshakable the institution that claimed the right to hold human beings as property.